Sharon, thanks for sticking with us. We're also joined for this Women's Sport on TV discussion by Steph Harries from the Women's Sports Group. And next to Steph is Helena Sykes from Sunset+Vine. And on the end, we have Georgina Green from the All England Lawn Tennis Club. So it feels like a good time to be having this discussion at the end of what's arguably been an extremely strong year for women's sport on TV. Record attendances, record viewing figures, the Women's Euros earlier this year. A total of 574,000 people attended games during the tournament, which was up from a total of 240,000 when the tournament took place in the Netherlands in 2017. More recently, at the weekend, a sold-out crowd of 43,000 watched New Zealand beat England in the Rugby Union World Cup final in Auckland. And in comparison, when the tournament took place in Ireland in 2017, across the entire competition, attendance was around 45,000, so a massive increase there. And of course, that popularity has been reflected in viewing figures as well. So in the UK, we've seen broadcast audiences for women's sports double from 2021 to 2022, according to the Women's Sport Trust. Sky's seen average audiences for the WSL increase from 111,000 last season to 220,000 this season, while BBC One and BBC Two have seen their average audiences go up from 393,000 to 522,000. More recently, last month, we saw around 2 million people tune in for the women's boxing match between Clarissa Shield and Savannah Marshall as well. So some really impressive figures, but obviously despite this, there's still work to be done, which is what we're going to focus on for the next 30 minutes or so. But before that discussion begins, I just wanted to reflect on those figures and just to ask all of you, starting with you, Sharon, if we may, what would you attribute this year's uplift in figures to in terms of viewership? If you know, is there something that we can particularly pin that on?
I mean, success obviously helps, but I think it's been a more in-depth look at creating heroes out of some of those athletes, and we know more about them. And because we know more about them, we care about their story, and I think this has a big part to play in caring about the outcomes of those events.
Steph, would you agree with that? Is there something which you could attribute that uplift in viewership this year to?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sharon. I think it's that, and I think there are multiple factors. I think that greater broadcast exposure is, of course, very important. It's volume and in prime time. So, but it's also the quality of the competition and growing supporter interest, growing attendances. It happens bottom up and top down. So the whole sports ecology has to work to see that increase. So the increase in viewing figures is a result of lots and lots of factors, and to Sharon's point, is absolutely about the engagement and greater storytelling about athletes that perhaps the general public weren't as familiar with before, but that goes with prime time, volume, exposure.
Helena, would you?
I would agree with that as well. Yeah. I think adding to that is the standardisation of making sure that the women's coverage is the same as men's. And it's what people are used to viewing. I think we've heard a lot today about new audiences that are coming through as well across other different platforms that is driving the increase in viewership because we're getting to different people and appealing to whole new audiences.
And Georgina, from an All England perspective as well, what's your take on those figures?
Yeah, I think it's been a culmination of a bit of a perfect storm for a lot of the mainstream sports. Obviously, from the All England perspective, we sit in a lucky position of relative gender parity from the beginning. But, you know, there has been growth in some respects. This year we already saw, it's the first time, as you saw in the Women's Sports Trust, we have more women's matches scheduled on centre court and number one court. But the numbers don't always tell the right story, and that didn't transpire on TV. Whether that's the 3 sets, 5 sets, or whether that's, if you dive into it, that perfect slot is our third match on. So that's 6 o'clock prime time, and actually only a third of those slots were filled with women's matches. So from a rights holder perspective, from a federation, there's absolutely more that we can be doing and pushing for.
I was just going to add to that on the parity point. So an event like Wimbledon, which obviously shows women's and men's tennis, we saw the Tokyo Olympics when it finally happened, and it was the most equitable games ever seen. So 49% of the athletes were female, and that makes a difference because you're constantly proliferating a message of parity in that. So it's everything. Everything has to work. So growing participation, growing exposure, to prime time slot, more female athletes, more women occupying the pages on newspapers, more female pundits. It's the whole thing. And growing revenues, obviously.
Yeah. And in those figures, I referenced WSL and the Women's Euros, and football generally seems to have kind of hogged a lot of the limelight. Would you say that there has been a kind of halo effect from football? Has it helped to lift up other women's sports on TV?
I think it opens the door for other women's sport, but then they need to step up as well. So, and when I say they, I mean everybody. It means the sport has to be good, but people have to give it the time. People have to give it a window. They have to be able to know and be knowledgeable about it to then take advantage of that halo effect. But for sure, the success definitely helps.
And Steph, you've been, excuse me, you've been in your role for I think since 2021. Which obviously is the period that we reflected on earlier. Can you give us a sense of what's happened to the value of rights and sponsorship deals? As that's an area that your organisation has quite a lot to do with, isn't it?
We do.
Yeah.
So previously, I was controller of production at BBC Sport, so I was obviously on the buying side, and now Women's Sports Group on the selling side. So actually, I was part of the team at BBC Sport who acquired Women's Super League, who acquired the Women's Euros. In my new role, we act on behalf of federations and rights holders to increase value and sell those rights. But the important thing to say is that to drive value, you have to have a really good product. You know, it has to be a really... the FA did a brilliant job of marketing the FA WSL, which my business represented the sale of domestically, pitched at the international deals. And what they did brilliantly was they thought about everything. It's about the scheduling. It's about the times of matches. It's about, of course, investment being channeled in the right ways. So in terms of rights, we are certainly seeing increased values, but they're still really suboptimal. I mean, the WSL is case in point. A market was created quite rightly. Sky, really stepped up. Jonathan Licht was a big supporter. Sky are big football, they're synonymous with football, and he absolutely invested. And to Helena's point, you need to put the same production values on men's and women's football from a coverage perspective. So it has become, the WSL has become the most, it's got the highest revenues and the broadest exposure of any women's league in the world, but it's still suboptimal. And it will be the next round, which we'll see whether that market continues to go upwards. And the reason it needs to go upwards is because you're trying to professionalise sport. You have to pay people properly, and that does attract brands. So it's a sort of ecosystem. So in answer, in short, too late. Rights are increasing for women's sports, but the product has to be strong enough and good enough for those rights to be paid by broadcasters. But broadcasters are re-evaluating post-pandemic their budgets to engage in new ways, and to the point of everyone on the previous panels, we are engaging audiences in very new ways.
And can you speak to those sponsorship deals as well? Is that similarly reflected, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sponsorship model is also changing. Brands are no longer just simply looking at eyeballs. You've got a very crowded, congested market in men's sport, particularly football, and brands are quite rightly thinking about purpose-driven campaigns and want to support and engage and get exposure in different ways with different consumers. So Visa's long-term sponsorship of UEFA football, MasterCard, Nike, long-term sponsor of women's sports, Budweiser, and you see this enormous growth trajectory for those brands with their sponsorships of major women's sports. So yes, it's attracting, and also you're seeing things like, you can interact differently as well as sponsors, because you can, as well as front of shirt, you can do sleeve, you can do shorts. There are all these different things that you can do with women's that you can't perhaps do with men's, established men's football in the packages. So I think sponsors are flocking because they see a massive opportunity, and we know that early adopters will reap the rewards.
And Helena, I guess there is an opportunity to do things in a new way as well. So there is a potential for maybe not entirely starting from scratch, but there is an opportunity to try things that perhaps the men's side are unable to do.
Yeah, and I think things that access to players, accessibility, a different take on, I think some women in sport, it's a very different proposition in the stories that they're going to tell. I think our storytelling is really key here. Whilst we may be trying to level up with all the production side of things, it's those things all around it, the ecosystem that Steph was talking about earlier, that we can access and try to evolve further through whatever means we can. For instance, working on the sevens rugby, where it is men's and women's, and they've pushed the levelling up of the women's over the last 4 years, have integrated that. The stories we can tell on the women's side of things have been phenomenal, and the access that we have created has been helped by using female staff, female camera women, and it's not about female only, it's about mixing these teams up and making female athletes feel very comfortable in the environment that we're filming them.
And how have you been able to do that? Is that something which you've had to work particularly hard at doing to try and encourage new entrants into those roles?
I think we have. We've had, I lead a team of people at Sunset+Vine, the content team. I'm very conscious that we need to bring diversity into our workplace, that in terms of women, we need to be seen. When I look around, I suddenly realise that actually I need to show myself off, to show people that there is someone to come for us. I'm taking this away from our point here, but we at the Commonwealth Games recently, we had a huge HPTI scheme, which we took on 150 trainees from socially and diverse backgrounds, and we've put them through a training scheme, which culminated for most people being actually at the games and working the games, and since then they've gone and been employed in industry. I don't have the exact figures of how many those are at the moment, though, but there are quite a few within Sunset+Vine, and a lot of those are women.
Georgina, do you find that that helps with coverage for Wimbledon as well, from a women's perspective, if the crews and the people who are conducting those interviews and arranging that coverage, if they're reflected?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, not just on screen but behind the scenes. And I think that's a key point of the discussion, is when we look at how many females are represented at the top level of sports administration, we're still asked to be part of the conversation. It's not actually leading the conversation, which is where we want these things to be. Making those key strategic decisions at those levels, still underrepresented. And I think, just going back on your point, what we've talked about with value, I think, particularly when we look at the Lionesses this year, that was over a decade worth of hard work of investing and funding in the development of the game and the grassroots level. Your pyramid has to be massive at the bottom for you to get that quality at the top. That's where it starts, and that trajectory, that is the long haul, that is the long game. But what you can use is utilise the either the wealth in the men's game, for example, or you can look at the mistakes that have been made, the things that don't work, and absolutely utilise that. So you've seen a product in women's football which has its absolute own right, which has developed its own sponsors. I mean, you don't have to ask a lioness twice to post a TikTok video, right? So, and that's all about generating value from that side of things. So once you've got the value of the sport itself that has its own worth, then you've absolutely got this new generation, new age of athletes who are absolutely levying their platform to talk about mental health issues, talking about abuse, talking about all of these other things that we wouldn't see necessarily from the men's side of the game. So I think it's a brilliant opportunity in that respect for women's sport, but also how does that come into and filter into the wider aspects of when we talk about women's sport on TV. Absolutely, it's about making sure that women are part of every part of that step.
I just wanted to add something on the brand side of things. So one of the pieces of feedback we had from a brand that we work with is actually that they're involved with women's sport because women are the decision makers in the household, and by being the decision makers, it means that they're more likely to approve of their brand and therefore buy their products in the shop.
Propensity to spend. Women have a propensity to spend. Yeah.
Exactly.
So if it is a house with a lady they will have a greater propensity to spend because they'll be in control of the household budget. And they reward with immediate spend if it's a brand that they align their values to.
Exactly. And also when they're choosing which subscriptions to have in a household.
It's very much true in my house. Georgina, I wanted to pick up on a point that you made earlier about scheduling. There was quite recently a clash between the New Zealand Rugby Union men's team and the women's team, where there was a men's test match scheduled and overlapped with one of the women's World Cup fixtures. So I just wanted to, because obviously I've painted quite a positive light with all of those figures, but an incident like that shows clearly that there is still some work to be done. So how do you think a situation like that occurs in the first place, and what needs to be done to ensure that that doesn't happen in future? And that's to whoever would like to pick that up.
Yeah, I think that goes back to my point about women not being part of that top-level administration discussion, yeah? And that's where that kind of filters through from. But from a scheduling perspective, each rights holder has to kind of, make that decision itself for its own strength, but absolutely clashing is never going to be to the benefit. I think those are those other discussions we've had and we talked about where you pair rights, where you're looking at how, with the ATP and WTA has been separate for a long time and now it's suddenly come together for the greater good of the sport. Hopefully that will be to the benefit. And then when you look at, for example, the 4 Grand Slams, why do we finish on the men's final? It's all of these things that were in our gift to start questioning and start challenging. Steph, I know you have some strong opinions.
I agree, and it's interesting with tennis, isn't it? Because, like you say, you're bundling, whereas the trend for FIFA and UEFA and the ICC have been to unbundle women's rights, so no longer selling. And there is no suggestion, by the way, that with the bundling and the ATP and the WTA going together, that it's almost come full circle. WTA led the way with the original 9 in 73 and the formation of WTA. So in many ways, tennis is streets ahead. But it's interesting, isn't it, that it's going the opposite way. And for too long, women's sport has been sold as a make weight for men's, and that has been a problem. To the point on New Zealand rugby, I mean, it is disgraceful. It is an embarrassing thing for New Zealand rugby because they have devalued their own proposition. We as a business want to get to a point where it's just sport. It's not men's sport, it's not women's sport, it's just sport. And they're a team, and they're under your banner. So, to have accidentally scheduled wrongly in a major competition is really disastrous. But I think it is symptomatic of the fact that there is groupthink at top level, and there wasn't a diversity of perspective around the table making the decision or noting the clash. And to George's point, you're so right. It's not just about having more women in decision-making roles at the top levels of sports administration. It's about having greater diversity across the board at the top levels of sports administration. Because if the title of this seminar is the endgame for women's sport, from my perspective, it's just it being sport. And it will no longer be other. I'm really I certainly am not of the belief that it's, women's sport against men's. We're not fighting against. We have to work together. There are a stack of reasons why, an Arsenal fan's an Arsenal fan. They're not an Arsenal fan for the men's team. They're an Arsenal fan. And they support both. And there is a togetherness and there is a power in togetherness. But unfortunately, New Zealand rugby, they really messed that up, and they have, in doing so, devalued their own property.
Sharon, one of the points that Steph made, was that just sport, not men's, not women's. That's a key difference for a lot of the sports you're involved in, isn't it? The start-up sports and some of the things that you touched on that in that last session.
Yeah, what I found really interesting working with the start-up sports is they just start equal. There's no assumption that they should be any different, because that's just how sport is. And I think it's partly to do with being younger and just not really seeing that there's any need to be different. So those sports start from a place of parity. They start from a place of being integrated into the same competitions. It's just weird to them that it would ever be any different. And because they don't have that legacy, imagine if you had the chance to start an entirely new sport now. It's exactly what you would do, right?
It's sort of what they've done with the 100. I mean, the 100 was set out as the brand was the 100. It wasn't the men's 100 and the women's 100. It was the 100. And they've double-headed, more by luck than judgment because of the pandemic, but it's worked, having that double-headed schedule. So to your point, that is a new sport. I mean, it is trying to take cricket out to a whole new audience, but it isn't. It's new and it's different, and they've had that opportunity. Can I just also add to my point a minute ago? Not men's sport, not women's sport, or para-sport. It's just sport. Very, very important point.
And that's how it was for the e-scooter championship, wasn't it, which you worked on?
Yeah, the e-scooter championship, and we were devising how the racing was going to work. We wanted to set it up so that men and women would race in the same races head-to-head against each other. And obviously there was lots of questions that we had to answer about whether it would really be fair. And so we had to compensate for weight advantage in that. But by doing that, in the first season, they had 2 races won by a female rider and 2 races won by a male rider, completely on merit.
So there's been parity across the board.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to just break. We've got about 5 minutes left, I think. So just in case anybody has any questions for any of the panelists. I'm not sure we do. Right at the back. There you go, Will. Entirely. So sorry, it was...
Sorry, I guess the question was, I know this session is more on TV, but given some of the restrictions on broadcasting rights and agendas, how are you using other digital platforms where you might have a bit more control to ensure that women's sports gets the space and the audience that they deserve?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So the previous panel was really fascinating. And we know that fans of women's sports, as a general rule, and certainly the Fan Project did a huge piece on this, but there's a lot of community-based fandom for women's sports. If you have had to look really hard for your sport, historically, you've probably consumed it on digital channels. So there is a sense of community fandom that is really markedly different. I mean, there's overlap. And by the way, fans of women's sports aren't just women. Fans of women's sports are men also. So it's important to say that. So it's not gendered, but fans of women's sport tend to be really digitally savvy. And as such, the opportunities to engage in new ways absolutely needs to be focused on how you do so in digital spaces. Also, the next generation of sports fans, Gen Z, who will become Gen Alpha, for all the reasons that people who are far better in this space than I am on the previous panel, and Sanjay also from TikTok said, this generation want content. They want athlete access. They want personalised content. They want it fast. They consume completely differently, and the opportunity women's sport has to really capitalise on that. And it's been done brilliantly by the SWNT over in the States. It's been done by the WNBA brilliantly, and I think we're waking up to those models here. So it's incredibly important, understanding fan behaviours. The Fan Project I mentioned had 10 billion data points. They analysed all of the social media history of these fans, and it was extraordinary. The viewing consumption was completely different to the men's version of the sports that they monitored. So live television or live output is one thing, but it's everything around it, which is what the previous panels have said, and particularly fans of women's sport, that is the opportunity. And that is why both digital platforms, but also brands, are absolutely all about the direct-to-consumer opportunity that presents.
Yeah, just one point on that, and I think it's absolutely fantastic that as we've come into this era with women's sport, that we have such a wider depth of platforms where we can utilise that content. But I think with all of these things, I think it's 42% of people engage with watching something once they've actually played the sport themselves. And when we look at women's sport and getting girls into sport, that's absolutely fundamental to the future of women's sport. For us at the All England Club, we had a 14 and under tournament brought into the championships this year, because that's a key age at which we see a huge dropout of girls participating in sport, and that is going to be fundamental to the future. So I think there's two sides to it, but having such a breadth of platforms where we can deliver those opportunities where they can see themselves represented, like we said, talking about what is the end game. The end game is not having 4 women up here talking about women's sport. It's about having women, so from gender parity to diversity to disabilities, everything represented the whole way along the spectrum, from playing sport to seeing it on TV to producing it behind the scenes.
That was the question I was going to close on. So you've already answered it, which is fantastic, because it's you're helping us out from a timing perspective. But Helena, I will ask you. So acknowledging the title, plotting the end game, and obviously the title of the overall event being FutureSPORT, if we look 5 years ahead into the future, what would you like women's sports on TV to look like?
Yeah, endgame is a bit ominous, isn't it?
It is ominous, yeah. We're not, it's not the end, but yeah.
5 years, normalisation, I think, is what we've been talking about. Levelling up across the whole ecosystem. And I'm just really excited from what I've heard here today, what's possible, and all the new audiences that we can attract, and the content, the shoulder programming, as well as live. I think that we've definitely got a lot of work to do, but I think we're heading in a positive direction.
And Steph, slightly different take on that question to you. What would you say is the priority in order to achieve what you set out earlier in terms of the end game for women's sport on TV? What's the sort of top priority for you?
Well, I don't think it's just about being on TV, if that's all right. I don't. Well, even if it's not all right, I don't think it's just all about being on TV. I am of the opinion that to counter negative gender stereotypes and to provide positive role models, we need to do it, of course, through linear output, and see more athletes on the top stage, which is in live coverage, and it's super important, and scheduling is a big part of that, but so is seeing women on the page of newspapers and doing podcasts and appearing on panels like this and being in decision-making positions. I think the whole thing has to change, because to normalise is to penetrate every aspect, and that is what leads to societal change. It's about perception. I would also really like to see women's sport become its own economic driver. I think it can, and I want it to be self-sustaining. And I think if we can keep going the way we're going, on the trajectory we are, it's possible. But I think all those things need to happen. That's certainly what our business is working very hard in on every aspect of the sports ecology, is to try and get to that point.
Sharon, and finally, for you, what would that look like in 5 years' time?
It has to be long-term commercial sustainability, and it has to be that not sponsoring women's sport isn't a favour, because right now it seemed to be a favour, and it should be because it's a good commercial decision to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's a fantastic way of summing it up. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you to Sharon, thank you to Steph, to Helena, and to Georgina as well.